The studio lights were brighter than usual. They weren't just strong, they were blinding, the kind that made anyone sweat even if they were completely calm. But at that moment, Sylvester Stallone didn't seem uncomfortable in the slightest. He was seated in the leather armchair, his body relaxed, legs spread, as if he were simply waiting for the right moment to speak. The audience was restless. There was something in the air, a tension almost palpable. Many held their cell phones, ready to record any interesting moment that might happen, and in that studio everyone knew that something was about to occur. On the other side of the table, Ethan Caldwell was positioned. He was a respected host, known for his calculated manner and interviews that, more than questions, were carefully crafted traps. His talent was making people stumble over their own words. He wasn't just any interviewer. He was someone who had made politicians hesitate, activists contradict themselves, and even Hollywood stars run out of responses. But that night, he would face a different challenge. Stallone wasn't an ordinary actor. He was an icon. And more than that, he was a man who knew exactly who he was. Caldwell smiled in a controlled manner, adjusting his tie with a rehearsed gesture. He leaned forward, and with a smooth and perfectly calculated voice asked his first question. "Mr. Stallone, you have always been seen as a symbol of strong and resilient masculinity. But don't you think that in today's world that image is outdated? That perhaps the definition of strength needs to be updated to something more inclusive?" The audience chuckled lightly. Some nodded, waiting for the answer. Everyone knew the purpose behind the question. Ethan wanted to create a moment. He wanted to trap Stallone, hoping he would get tangled up in his own response. But Stallone did not hesitate. He blinked slowly, leaning forward. His elbows rested on his knees, and he exhaled through his nose before speaking. "So you want to know if I think being strong is something bad nowadays?" Caldwell smiled as if he had gotten what he wanted. "Well, I think the world has evolved. Times have changed. Don't you think that the idea of a man solving everything with brute force is outdated?" Silence. But not just any silence. It was the kind of silence that made people uncomfortable, that made the audience shift in their seats. Stallone ran his hand along his chin, thoughtful, and then laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh, it was a genuine guffaw. He looked at Caldwell and asked his question, "Are you serious? Do you really believe that resilience is a problem?" Ethan adjusted his tie again, an unconscious movement that betrayed his discomfort. "I believe it can become a problem when it prevents people from being vulnerable." Stallone nodded slowly, as if processing the answer. Then he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Let me ask you something. If someone broke into your house tonight, would you rather have someone strong there to protect your family, or someone who sat down and tried to discuss their feelings with the intruder?" The audience reacted immediately. Some people laughed, others applauded. Ethan opened his mouth, trying to regain control of the conversation, but Stallone wasn't finished yet. "Resilience isn't about going around yelling. It isn't about punching walls. Resilience is standing firm when everything falls apart. It's protecting those who depend on you. It's having discipline, respect, hard work. Do you really think the world doesn't need that anymore?" Ethan forced a laugh, but there was a different glimmer in his eyes, something bordering on hesitation. This interview wasn't going as he had planned, but he wasn't ready to give up. "All right," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "but don't you think that Hollywood has helped to glorify violence as the solution to problems? Let's be honest, many of your films show exactly that." Stallone shook his head without hesitation. "Hollywood glorifies many things. Have you ever seen a movie where a guy saves the world by filling out paperwork?" The audience burst into laughter. Even some members of Caldwell's crew smiled, but Ethan still had cards up his sleeve. He adjusted the notes on his lap and changed strategy. "But let's talk about influence. You built your career playing tough characters, men who solve problems with their fists. Don't you feel responsible for promoting a different idea of what a hero is?" Stallone took a deep breath, as if he had been expecting that question. He straightened up in his chair and looked directly at the host. "First of all, I make movies. Movies aren't real. You know that, right?" He raised an eyebrow. "The last time I checked, I've never gone 15 rounds with Apollo Creed in real life. I've never taken down an entire army with a knife and a red bandana. I've never climbed those stairs in Philadelphia and, alone, solved all of humanity's problems." The audience laughed again, but Ethan remained serious. He didn't want the conversation to turn into a comedy show. But movies shape culture, Mr. Stallone. Children grow up watching Rambo and Rocky. Don't you think we should show them heroes who solve problems without violence? Stallone crossed his arms. He had been expecting that question. Man, have you ever seen Rocky? He shook his head. The whole movie was about a guy who refuses to give up. It wasn't about beating someone up, it was about perseverance, about moving forward when no one believes in you. And Rambo? He just wanted to be left alone. If people had simply let him walk the city in peace, nothing would have happened. The audience began to react more intensely, applauding, agreeing. Ethan pressed his lips. He knew he was losing control of the narrative, but he wasn't ready to give up. But let's be honest, Mr. Stallone, today's world isn't the same as when you made your most famous films. Don't you think that the definition of strength needs to change to something more progressive? Stallone narrowed his eyes. He didn't rush to answer. He tapped his fingers on the arm of the chair, as if pondering. Have you ever seen a building being demolished? He asked. Ethan blinked. What? Have you ever seen a demolition? Have you ever watched a building being destroyed? Ethan hesitated. Well, yes. Stallone nodded. It takes only a few seconds. Someone pushes a button and everything collapses. Now tell me, have you ever seen a building being constructed? The host fell silent. Stallone continued. Building takes years, brick by brick, steel by steel. People working day and night to create something that lasts. But who holds the detonator? They don't care about that. They don't think about the work, the sweat, the dedication that went into it. They just want to see everything crumble. The room fell silent. Ethan realized that for the first time he was being tested, but Stallone wasn't done yet. So you want to move forward? To where? Because moving forward without knowing where you're going isn't progress. It's just destruction disguised as change. The audience began to stand and applaud. Ethan Caldwell realized that the interview was slipping from his control, but by then it was too late. The energy in the studio changed. Ethan Caldwell realized that the conversation wasn't going as he had planned. He always controlled the pace, steered the narrative, but this time something was different. Stallone wasn't stumbling. He wasn't on the defensive. He was the master of the stage, and the audience knew it. But Ethan wasn't going to give up so easily. He shifted in his chair, trying to regain control of the situation. All right, I understand your point, he said, forcing a smile. But let's be realistic, Mr. Stallone. The masculinity you represent, this idea of resilience, isn't it preventing people from evolving? Today we talk a lot about inclusion, about understanding that strength can also be vulnerability. Wouldn't it be better if men were encouraged to be more emotionally open instead of clinging to that image of toughness? Stallone tilted his head, thoughtful. He slowly scratched his chin before answering. Have you ever met a firefighter? Ethan blinked. What do you mean? A firefighter, Stallone repeated. Or a police officer, or a guy from the army. Hell, even a single mother who works 2 jobs to put food on the table. Have you ever talked to those people? Have you ever asked them if resilience is a problem? The silence in the audience was absolute. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Stallone continued. These people don't have the luxury of questioning whether strength still matters. They live in a world where resilience isn't a choice, it's a necessity, because without it, nothing works. The problem isn't resilience. The problem is that some people think that being strong is something bad. As if it were a flaw, as if it were a problem to be fixed. A man in the audience let out a low whistle. Some people began murmuring, others nodded silently. The atmosphere was charged. Ethan pressed his lips together, realizing he needed to change strategy. But what about the influence this has on culture? He asked, trying to regain control. Many would say that this mentality perpetuates a cycle of violence, that it teaches people to solve problems the wrong way. Don't you feel any responsibility for that? Stallone smiled, but it wasn't a mocking smile. It was the smile of someone who had heard that argument many times before. You want to know the truth, he said, leaning slightly forward. The world is a tough place. You can try to ignore that, but it doesn't change the facts. Life will knock you down, whether you like it or not. And when that happens, the only thing that matters is whether you can get back up. The audience erupted in applause. Ethan Caldwell took a deep breath. He was losing the audience, and he knew it, but he wasn't ready to give in. "But don't you think we are at a moment where we can redefine what it means to be strong?" he asked, his voice lower, more controlled. "What used to be called strength was often just repression. Can't we move forward and build something new?" Stallone laughed, shaking his head. "Have you ever seen a building being demolished?" Ethan blinked. The audience fell silent. Some people held their breath, already waiting for the answer. "Have you ever seen it?" Stallone insisted. The host hesitated. "Yes, I have." Stallone nodded slowly. "And how long did it take to destroy it?" Ethan frowned. "Seconds, I suppose." "Exactly. Seconds." Stallone raised one of his hands and snapped his fingers. A button, a command, and everything falls apart. "Now tell me, how long did it take to build that building?" Ethan did not answer. "Years," Stallone continued. "Brick by brick, steel by steel, men and women working day and night to erect something that lasts. But who holds the detonator? They don't care. They don't think about the sweat, the sacrifice, the effort of those who built it. They just want to see everything crumble." The silence in the studio was absolute. Even the filming crew had stopped to listen. "You speak of change," Stallone said, his voice calm yet filled with conviction. "But change to where? Because moving forward without knowing where you're going isn't progress. Sometimes the only thing between chaos and order is a group of people willing to resist." The audience began to applaud, first slowly, then more forcefully. Ethan Caldwell felt the control of the interview slipping from his hands. He had come in expecting to find an easy target, a celebrity who would get lost in his own words. But Stallone wasn't just answering, he was dominating the conversation. Ethan shifted in his chair, trying to regain control. "All right, but let's be realistic," he said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the applause. "The world has changed, times have changed, and we need to adapt. Don't you think that this kind of outdated thinking is what prevents society from evolving?" Stallone exhaled slowly. He could have responded with another joke, with another impactful phrase. But this time, he changed his tone. His voice became lower, calmer. "Have you ever heard of men who have worked hard their entire lives, Cartier?" he asked. "Who put everything they had into something, who supported their families, who built something out of nothing?" Ethan did not respond. "Do you know what happens when they are told that what they did is worthless?" Stallone continued. "That everything they built is outdated. Have you ever seen the look on their faces when they realize that the people who came after them only want to wipe everything away without thinking about what it means?" The audience fell silent. Even those who disagreed couldn't ignore the intensity of the moment. "You talk about change as if it were always good," Stallone said. "But have you ever stopped to think that some things are worth preserving? That not everything needs to be destroyed just because someone decided it's outdated?" Ethan Caldwell did not respond immediately. For the first time, he hesitated. But Stallone wasn't finished yet. "And you want to know the truth?" Stallone said, his voice firm. "Weak people hate being reminded that they are weak." The studio was shocked. Some people stood up, others clapped. Some were simply paralyzed. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence was broken by a roar of applause. The interview, which was supposed to be just another ambush for a Hollywood actor, had become something much larger. It wasn't just about Stallone. It was about something at the heart of that entire discussion. True strength, the kind that doesn't need to be proven, only lived. And outside that studio, something even greater was happening. The interview should have ended there, but something had changed in the air. Ethan Caldwell realized that there was nothing more to say. He had prepared questions, rehearsed answers, arguments ready to deconstruct any discourse. But at that moment, none of that mattered. He had lost control. And the worst part, he knew that the audience had noticed it too. The public was no longer waiting for a twist from Ethan. They were focused on Stallone, wanting to hear more, wanting to understand, Because deep down, what he was saying wasn't just about movies or Hollywood. It was about something much bigger. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. He forced a smile. "All right, Mr. Stallone. That's an interesting perspective. But at the end of the day, we can't ignore that society has changed. And with it, values have changed too. Isn't it time to leave certain ideas behind?" Stallone didn't rush to answer. He tilted his head, analyzing his interlocutor. Then, in a lower, almost reflective tone, he asked, "Have you ever heard the phrase, 'If hard times create strong men, and strong men create good times, then good times create weak men?'" Ethan fell silent. Stallone continued, "We live in an age where people confuse comfort with progress. They think that because life is easier, it means that strength is no longer necessary. But let me tell you something, my friend. The world will never be a safe place all the time. There will always be challenges. There will always be moments when you need to get up and face something difficult. And if no one else knows how to do that, then who will protect what really matters?" The audience began murmuring, absorbing every word. "You speak of change, of moving forward," Stallone continued. "But do you know what happens when a ship is sinking? When things really go wrong?" Ethan swallowed hard. "People look for the strongest men on board, the ones who know what to do, the ones who don't panic. Because when chaos arrives, no one wants philosophical debates. They want someone to hold the helm and keep the ship afloat." The audience applauded. Ethan Caldwell looked at his notes, as if searching for something, anything, to regain control. But there was nothing left. He forced another smile. "I understand what you're saying, but—" Stallone raised his hand, calmly interrupting him. "The truth is that some people spend so much time trying to change the world that they forget to ask themselves if what they're doing really improves anything, whether destroying the past is really the answer." Absolute silence. And then something surprising happened. Ethan Caldwell did not try to counter-argue anymore. He just nodded. For the first time in the entire interview, he didn't try to force a response. He knew it was useless. Stallone leaned back in his chair, as if the interview were over for him. He didn't need one last catchphrase. He didn't need to prove anything. And outside that studio, the impact of that conversation was already spreading. Within minutes, clips of the interview were all over the internet. Edited videos, memes, heated discussions. And while some people tried to downplay what Stallone had said, most knew the truth. That day, he didn't just win a debate. He made the world stop and think. Did you like this story? Subscribe for more content that makes you reflect, because in a world full of noise, the truth still matters.